Hey guys, welcome back. Arcturus the other day sent over a huge box of guns and parts, and it was a lot of fun to go through. Recently I reviewed a couple of their newer polymer body M4s. I've got links to those down in the description if you want to check them out. They're fantastic airsoft guns. If you guys are just getting into airsoft or you want a solid airsoft gun that performs well out of the box, is tuned great, grab one of those. They do a fantastic job for a really reasonable price. Aside from those, they sent over a bunch of parts. And Arcturus said, hey, do you have any AKs sitting around? I said, yeah, I got a handful. I got some E&Ls, Arcturus. I've got an old Echo 1 I've had for quite a while that Jag sent over a while back. Gosh, that was a minute ago. Anyway, they said, hey, we've got a bunch of AK parts we're going to send over. Just, here's a challenge. Go install as many of these parts as you can in an AK and just see what the challenge is. See what it takes to do this. See how compatible the parts are. I'm like, okay. Cool, it sounds like fun, actually. I love weird projects like that, where I take a gun and I've just got parts and I install it and see how well things work and what I can make happen. I had my pick of AKs as far as what I owned. I've got a couple of E&Ls that I wouldn't mind installing parts in. I've got an old Echo 1. I decided to go with the E&L AK12. It's a little bit newer model. It's one of their Essential series, and I really loved running it, but I wanted something a little bit more from it. So I'm going to take the Arcturus parts that they sent over and install it in there and see what kind of potential I can bring out of that airsoft gun. Putting a nice MOSFET, nice gearbox, some other parts in there, I think will really go a long way. So I'm going to talk briefly about what they sent over and what I'm going to use in this build, and then we're going to go sit down on the tech table and see what happens. This is their newer AK grip. It's kind of Magpul reminiscent. I'm really looking forward to using this. I like the AK12 grip, but I also like this grip much better. So looking forward to installing that. They also sent over one of their polymer rotary hoppets. These are pretty neat. I got to check one out and install one and look it over a little while ago, sometime earlier this year. It's been a minute. But I really like these. Their rotary polymer hoppets for the AK are fantastic. I did open up the E&L on my workbench already, so I don't have it sitting here in front of me, except in a couple of pieces that I'll show in a second here. But I did notice that I do have to modify the outer barrel of the AK a little bit to get this to fit, so it's going to take a little bit of doing. So that's one of those challenges for sure. Piston and piston head from Arcturus. These are great parts. Polymer piston head and metal tooth piston. Big plus there. The E&L already has those, but I'm going to go ahead and use the Arcturus ones. The correct selector for the AK12 for the 2-round burst settings. So you have 4 selector settings there: safe, semi, 2-round burst, and full auto. So this will be really nice to have. Just a plain old polymer cylinder head. I'm going to use this. A metal bearing spring guide. This is one of their quick change ones for their gearbox. So it'll be nice to have a metal one instead of a basic plastic one. 13-to-1 steel gear set. It's going to up my rate of fire a little bit. It's also got a sector chip on there already pre-installed, so that's a big plus. Going to shim that in the gearbox there. And I've got 2 motors here. They're 2 different Arcturus motors. They're both upgrade neodymium magnet motors. One's a little more balanced and one's a little more torquey. So I'll probably go with the torqueier motor, but I'm kind of back and forth. I'm probably going to try both of them and see which one I like better. So I've actually only tried one of them so far. Next up, we've got a Arcturus gearbox shell. I already checked, and this actually will fit really nicely in the E&L body. So that's a plus. It's a pretty hefty shell. I've worked with a lot of Arcturus parts and guns, and I really do like their parts. Something I was a little curious about, this is an 8mm gearbox. A lot of gearboxes, and specifically Arcturus actually, I noticed that they go with 2 sets of bushings and 1 set of bearings. This particular gearbox goes with 2 sets of bearings and 1 of bushings, and the bushings are on the sector gear. So I'm going to use this setup either way, but it was just a curious difference. I've also got one of the Perun, I never know how to pronounce that, to be honest. One of their AK12 MOSFETs that does have the 2-round burst option on it. So this is really cool. I also got to use this in the PE model that I was sent. It was one of the prototypes a while back to review, and these are fantastic. I love these. The whole company as a whole, they make, I think, some of the best MOSFETs on the market. They are really top notch. Never had issues with them, and they are really fantastic and actually very well priced as well. So that'll be a breeze and actually a pleasure to install in this E&L AK12. And lastly, obviously I've already got the E&L AK12 disassembled on my workbench. I've talked about recently in other reviews for their polymer M4s, the Arcturus new modular stock that they have. I really, really like them. They've got the same dial on the back. You can twist counterclockwise, and this just pops open. It's a captive back plate that just hinges, and it's a really neat design. I love the look and the style and the feel of these. They're great quality, and they've got a quick detach sling point on either side, and they're super quick and easy to install, just like any M4 stock for the most part. Unfortunately, it's a little tough to rear wire this particular AK to the buffer tube, or else I'd do that in a heartbeat just for the simplicity of battery storage here. The wiring it's probably possible. It looks like there's a hole going to the buffer tube, but it looks like I'd have to hardwire it or put pins in through the back of this, and I'm not sure I quite want to go that route, so I'm going to retain the wiring up and under the dust cover, I think. But I really like these stocks. I think it'll really add some character to an AK-12 and make it look and feel a good bit different. So I wanted to make sure this fit on here, and it's actually even more solid on this gun than the original E&L AK-12 stock is. So I like that a lot. Wobbly stocks, not a fan of. This one is just that right amount of play or wobble that, it's kind of within tolerance. So this looks and feels really cool. So that's, I think, all the parts I'm going to install in this build. Let's go ahead and head over to the tech table and get to work. In order to complete this build, I will need to retain a handful of parts from the E&L AK-12, namely the nozzle, tappet plate and tappet plate spring, as well as the cylinders. This is a Type 0 cylinder with no ports in it, which is appropriate for the roughly 455mm inner barrel that the AK-12 will have. I'm also retaining the motor cage and a handful of other necessary springs and screws and such. So nothing too crazy, but for the most part, I'll have a spare gearbox left over after this build. The first step in getting the gearbox set up will be to shim it. I have a 13:1 ratio gear set here from Arcturus. They look like pretty solid gears. I actually really like them. So I'm going to get these shimmed, but in order to do that, the first thing I need to do is get the motor installed so I can get the motor height right for the pinion. So I'm going to start with the 19T motor. This is a 28K motor, so I'm going to get this swapped into the motor cage here, and so we can get the shimming process going. The stock E&L motor is their ELM 120. This has regular ferrite magnets, pretty limited torque. It'll run the M110 spring that's in there, but I wouldn't push it past too far that, and I wouldn't expect too much of an amazing rate of fire without really pumping a lot of power through it. The new Arcturus motor actually has neodymium magnets and has a ton more torque. Really looking forward to testing this out. All right, first thing, I got the gearbox shimmed here. 13:1 gears are pretty straightforward to shim. Didn't take a whole lot of doing, and I think they sound reasonably good there. Got still a little bit of axial play. They're not like OCD shimming perfect, but they're within my acceptable limits for what I consider good shimming. I did notice that the front of the gearbox here, on both the front and the back of the windows for the cylinder, are a little bit radiused. I'm going to take a small metal file here and kind of open those radius ports up just a little bit, just to give myself a little more peace of mind. And here's the cylinder windows after a little bit of work with a metal file. The cylinder head gets a really nice tight fit in there. I like that. The nozzle's pretty tight on there too. I'm gonna make sure that's got a little bit of lubrication in it before I reassemble the whole thing and make sure the spring there is sufficient, because it's kind of on that border of almost too tight for comfort, but could get a really good air seal. Also, the Arcturus piston and piston head. This is a ported polycarb bearing piston head, has bearings behind it. I'm going to make sure that's Loctited in as well. And the tooth rack on the piston is all steel with the second to last tooth removed. I haven't lubricated this O-ring, so let's see how the seal is. I'd say with the nozzle, with no lubrication whatsoever, it's good. Not perfect, but good. And that's before lubrication. So after I put a little grease on the O-ring, I expect that to pick up a little bit. It's about the same with or without the nozzle. As far as the angle of engagement goes with the sector gear to the piston, it looks all right. I'm actually okay with that. If I was getting really, really picky and like the most amazing, perfect, couldn't get better build in the world, I'd probably push it back a little bit. Probably install a sorbo pad. I have fewer issues with version 3 gearboxes, so I Usually don't install sorbet pads in those unless I really want to or need to, at least in my builds, or if a client requests them. But stock, without any correction, I'd say that's okay for my purposes right now. I went ahead and dropped in the Perrin AK12 MOSFET here. This is their hybrid MOSFET specifically for the AK12 that has the 2-round burst option. I really, really love these. Very, very cool, and I really love the Perrin MOSFETs that are out there. I've used quite a few of them, and I've never had issues with them. Very, very good. I'm really glad Arcturus went with these as well for their AK12 setup. This particular MOSFET comes with a trigger bar just for the AK12. It's got the little magnet there. That's why it's the hybrid system. So I'm going to be using that instead of the stock bar that comes with the trigger that I'll be using from Arcturus. Additionally, this particular MOSFET came with a couple of different selector plates. I went ahead and picked this one because it's appropriate for this setup. The gearbox itself does come with this little black stopper bar here. You can unscrew it, adjust it, and then tighten it back down, and that'll stop your trigger at a certain pull distance. With the MOSFET adjustment for trigger sensitivity, you can actually adjust how far your trigger has to travel before it fires and then stop it with this at a certain point. Very, very cool. So you can actually have a really, really slight travel distance, almost a hair trigger practically, with this particular setup. Thankfully, this has been a rather pleasant and pretty straightforward build so far. But lastly here, before getting onto the hop up and setting the motor up and everything, I'm just going to use the original spring that was in the E&L. Pop it in. Since this is a quick change gearbox, I can just do that very easily. I've got the metal bearing spring guide here. And it's all set up to go. All right, I have the motor height adjusted. Let's try a 7.4 volt first and see what happens. I'm gonna see if I can hit semi with the selector. I'm kind of doing it manually with my hand here. That sounds pretty good. Let's see if I can hit 2-round burst. And then full auto. Yeah, it sounds great on a 7.4 volt. I'm gonna plug in an 11.1 volt here. It's a similar battery. Both PEC box batteries are just what I happen to grab. Nice and snappy 2-round burst, that sounds great. And full auto is just zippy. That is fantastic. With the gearbox completed, I've gone ahead and installed the gear train that's here for the AK12. It's a particular one, so it's a little different from the regular AK. This cam usually goes right about here, but because we're using the trigger over travel block here, honestly I'm not sure what this little part is called, but we're using that, so we don't actually need this little cam here anymore. I did have to shave down a little bit of metal on the inside here and tighten this screw down. Also, the pack of the gear train parts did not actually include the screw, and the screw from the E&L did not have sufficient length to actually work with this correctly, so I did have to go into my parts bag of screws and find one with a reasonable length. Upon attempting to install the gearbox in the receiver, I did notice some of the E&L parts did not play well with the Arcturus parts, specifically this component of the gear train. This is from the Arcturus AK12 setup. It's got, I think, 1 or 2 extra teeth here for a little more travel distance. And this guy did not want to fit into it very well. So don't mind my really poor metal file work there, but it did take a little bit of work for this guy to fit into here. I did have to make a few modifications to the gear train as well as other parts. This is the button you push to fold the stock on the E&L AK12. I did have to Dremel a little bit of this out because the back of the gear train actually pushes on it, and there is not quite enough room to get it comfortably back all the way. So I did have to Dremel that down a little bit. Maybe not completely necessary, but it did feel a little bit better in the end. Additionally, I did have to grind down the back of this particular gear in the train. It did push on that a little bit, and a little bit more room made at least a little bit of difference there. You can see it really doesn't use that last tooth a whole lot when it's all the way forward, so I didn't feel it was completely necessary. Additionally, I did have to grind down the bottom of the screw a little bit, something I hate doing because it can mess up the threads. This screw is just too long to fit in this Arcturus gearbox, and I did have to put a small washer under it. You can kind of see there, but it is fairly tight now and it works as expected. Additionally, I did have to Dremel out a small portion of inside of the pistol grip here. This Arcturus grip, I really love the look and feel, but it is very tight on the E&L gear motor cage. And it almost ripped a connector off. It's like, oh my gosh, that was really nerve-wracking. But thankfully it's fine. I did have to Dremel out a small portion there, again, because the gear train moves more, and it actually would hit on the top of the pistol grip and not allow the gear train to go into safe. I did get the full auto, safe, semi, and 2-round burst to work, but unfortunately some of these selector positions are a little bit odd. So safe works just fine. Full auto, you kind of have to get between safe and the top notch there. It's a little tough. And then 2-round burst sits kind of where I would expect full auto to be. Semi at the very bottom there. So everything works as expected, but it's just not exactly as you'd expect for how an AK12 should function. All right, let's go ahead and work on the hop up here. Now I did some preliminary fitment before filming, and I know that the outer barrel is going to take a little bit of modification for how the hop up is going to fit into it. And that's specifically for this portion on the front right here, where the C-clip goes and little screw, grub screw goes through it. If that weren't there, it would fit perfectly into the outer barrel, but unfortunately a little bit needs to be Dremeled out of it. The original E&L hop-up fits right about here, and that's just fine, but it doesn't have the protrusion on the bottom here, so I'm going to have to take off probably about 1 inch or ½ an inch of this section here on the outer barrel for the new hop-up chamber to fit. And to show you exactly, it fits width-wise, but depth just doesn't fit, unfortunately, so I am going to have to Dremel a little bit out at the bottom there, and this being steel might take a little bit of work. Transferring the E&L inner barrel over to the new Arcturus rotary hop-up really wasn't too much of a pain. It's actually pretty quick. This is very easy to assemble, and I rather like the chamber. The bucking that's included fits rather well, and it adjusts quite far down, so if I want, it looks like I can run pretty heavy BBs. There's also an O-ring under this dial, so it stays nice and tight where it's at. However, modifying the E&L outer barrel took a lot more time and effort and honestly energy than I ever anticipated. I did have to cut out this bottom portion here, and you can kind of see how much, a little over ½ an inch. But I tell you, that was very difficult. This is extremely tough steel, and I really did not have adequate tools for the job. I ended up using a combination of a Dremel, which I kept having to tighten the bit on, a metal file, and a hacksaw, and some pliers. So you can imagine how much work that took. And now the Arcturus hop-up fits perfectly in the E&L outer barrel. Something you learn really quickly when you're working on airsoft guns is that not all parts are compatible with all airsoft guns. So you might pick up part A and want to install it in airsoft gun platform B. It doesn't always work. Sometimes the specs are just that much different, and they can be off by just a hair, and it doesn't work well or work at all for that matter. And in some cases, that was the case with this project. I got everything to work pretty well. It was definitely a lot of time and a lot of sweat and a lot of, not quite tears, but a lot of effort. During the last portion of that shooting test with the chrono, the outer barrel, I didn't actually have it fixed. I was testing it. Started to drift forward, so the FPS dropped a little bit there. But with the 0.2 gram BB, I'm hitting about 380 feet per second, and with the 2.5, which was what I was chronoing with, I was hitting about 335, 340 in there, which is about what I'd expect. I was also running a small PEC box battery. It's just what I had on hand, and I was getting about 24 to 25 rounds a second, which I think is fantastic. It sounded really good. I was very happy with their performance, but getting there was a lot of work. I'll tell tell you, I love the look of this. It really is quite unique, adding this new Arcturus stock and pistol grip to it. They look very, very different. I think it's definitely going to stand out in the field, and people are going to ask, what on earth is this? Because it's a custom gun. You just never know. Getting some of these Arcturus parts, especially the AK12 parts, to fit properly in here took a lot of work, especially getting all the AK12 gear trains set up correctly so that all the functionality was there. I did have to Dremel off a lot of parts. You saw all the little bits and pieces I had to go through. So ultimately some parts work. Oh, I do need to mention too that ultimately I ended up using the E&L hop-up chamber, because from what I could tell, I think the E&L nozzle is a little bit different than the Arcturus nozzle, so it didn't fit terribly well in the Arcturus hop-up chamber. I ended up using the E&L hop-up chamber and got the FPS back right away. When I used the Arcturus chamber, unfortunately it was quite a bit softer, by like over 100 FPS softer. So I love the Arcturus chamber. I have had great experiences with it. It works really, really well in Arcturus guns, but in this particular build, it didn't fit as expected, and so I ended up going back to the E&L hop-up chamber. I think some things I probably would have done differently if I had known all this is going to happen, was just leave the outer barrel on here, because obviously the modifications probably weren't necessary, but I did want to try the Arcturus chamber in there, so now I know. Hindsight's always 20/20, at least for the most part. I'll probably put the E&L gearbox shell back in here, but retain a lot of the Arcturus parts that go in it. I think the E&L shell fits a little bit better in here, and I think I'll have a little bit better luck as far as just parts fitting better and such along those lines. So this is a really cool build. I'm very happy I did it. It definitely took a lot of effort and time. I think I probably put like 4 or 5 hours into the whole setup of this thing. And that included all of the hacksawing, the dremeling of the outer barrel and such, because that took a lot of work, especially some of the small like grinding and modification in the back here to get some of the gear train to fit, just the fitment and going back and forth and trying it. That definitely took a lot of time. Really, really cool build. Very happy I did it. Big thanks to Arcturus for sending all this stuff out. Really, really fun build, even though it took, I'll tell you, a lot of work. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.